Hello everybody, and welcome to this video about the West Country, a history of England's overlooked heartland. I am very excited to bring this to you because anyone who's known me for more than about 30 seconds will know I love to talk about this subject. It's where I grew up, it's the place I'm from, it's beautiful, and I don't feel it gets the attention it deserves. When you go on Google or YouTube, I don't find much at all about West Country history, but we have been here for a very long time. I feel like there's a lot that's affected us, lots of really interesting stories and legends that we have, but we've never really told our own story much. So I hope you enjoy my attempt to set this somewhat right and tell a little bit of it right now. So, who are we? What is the West Country? What are we like? I think when you talk to people about the West Country, they might think of things like pasties, a good old ploughman's lunch, and of course cider. These days, we're also known for water sports, surfing, sailing, kite surfing, and for our beautiful beaches and pristine countryside. We've got plenty of mystery and legends too. Pretty much every place in the southwest has its own stories of strange happenings and events, sometimes passed down for centuries in local folklore. We can be a fun place, a place with good food and drink, a place with more than a bit of mystery. In terms of how we tend to look at the rest of the country, I've got this West Country map of England. Cornwall, surfer and pasty land, Devon, more to it than cows of course, and of course the vexed subject of cream, jam and scones, or should it be scones, cream and jam? I'm not going to get into that, I am strictly neutral on the issue. Somerset, home of cider, Dorset, retirement homes. That's a big thing in much of the southwest, especially coastal communities, as lots of people come here to retire. Dirty beaches along the Sussex coast? Absolutely. They don't know what a proper beach is. Kent, dangerously close to France? Definitely dodgy. And London? Well, that's where the second home buyers are. Everywhere else is the north. I remember growing up thinking anywhere north of Bristol was the north. Living outside the southwest, I find that when I say I'm from the West Country, I'll sometimes get blank looks. People here say it's all down south. But I don't put us in the same category as those dirty beach people, the dangerously close to France people, or the second home buyers. I feel like we're our own thing. We love our food, our drink, our mysterious local legends, a good surfing session, or a nice long walk in the countryside. We love life. What's that then? Let's move on to a few more serious maps about the West Country. Here's one from Lancaster University showing different cultural areas of England. You can see the West Country there in orange in the bottom left corner of our land. Like the Midlanders, Brummies, Scousers, Mancunians and Geordies, we're definitely our own thing. But you probably won't see as many of us around, partly because we're a bit more obscure, and partly because there aren't that many of us. If you take our 4 core counties together, we actually have a smaller population than Wales. There are more Welsh people knocking about than West Country folk, yet at the same time the West Country covers about a fifth of England, 20% of the land, and only about 3.5% of the population of the country. In terms of religion, more people in the southwest ticked other in the latest census than anywhere else in the country, especially in Cornwall, South Devon and the area around Glastonbury. There are more people here perhaps looking to older legends for religious inspiration than elsewhere, which adds to that mysterious image of our peninsula. As for West Country identity, YouGov polled people on this. Devon topped the list at 89%, with majorities in Somerset, Dorset and Cornwall identifying as West Country. Bristol was 88%, although I'm not sure how you can be a proper West Country person if you live in a city, but that's just me. Wiltshire and Gloucestershire came in at 44% and 39%, and surprisingly 5% of people in Worcestershire identified as West Country. I've even been to places in Wales like Monmouth, whose museum talked of the place as being a West Country rather than a Welsh town. It's not often you hear of us in the media, especially not in a serious context. When we do get attention, it's often light-hearted stuff. The Wurzels are a band a lot of people know and love. I Am a Cider Drinker is a West Country anthem, and I've heard football fans of West Country teams sing Where Be That Blackbird Too from the terraces. Doc Martin is a West Country story from the mind of legendary Dorset actor Martin Clunes. In Doc Martin, the Cornish characters are lovely, but maybe a little bit slow or quirky. That stereotype probably fits more than I'm comfortable to admit, but it's not the whole truth. Accents can be strong. I try to speak RP now, that's received pronunciation, so that people like you can understand me, and people around me as I don't live there anymore. But when I spent a summer working back home, people up north told me, "You've come back with a right West Country accent, you have." There's a famous scene in Hot Fuzz where policemen have to get translated to understand a local talking about hedges. I understood every word to the amazement of the Canadian friend I was watching it with. My mother was there when they filmed that film in the town very close to where I grew up. The sitcom This Country, set in Gloucestershire, is probably the most accurate thing I've seen about rural southwest life. It is shockingly close to my late teenage and early 20s years. Again though, it's comedy. Nice people, but a bit quirky and maybe backward. And that's often the picture the rest of the country, and even the world, has of us, when they think of us at all. The reality is a little less rosy. In terms of income, we tend to earn much less than much of the country, especially compared to the south right next door to us. Yet, with all those London and home counties buyers snapping up second homes and holiday lets, our property prices are sky high. That makes it hard for locals to afford to even rent a place to live, let alone buy a house. Even goods can cost more. Fuel has to be transported further, pushing up prices, though thankfully we produce more than our fair share of food. Flooding has been a big issue. The winter of 2012 to 13 was very difficult in my area, with some people living for months without proper sanitation. The county had to appeal to London for emergency help, but it didn't come, not quickly anyway. The Dutch, however, were amazing. They sent equipment and expertise that made a real difference, in some ways actually more of a help to us than London was. So thank you, Holland. And yet, when the flooding hit the Thames Basin that same year, affecting London and the home counties, the government couldn't deploy emergency assistance fast enough. That same winter, the railway line along the South Devon coast towards Plymouth and Cornwall was out of action for months. Can you imagine any other part of the country being without rail services for that long, with so little being done? So, in the West Country, we've learnt to sort things out ourselves. I knew friends who had a fire at the hotel they worked in and dealt with it themselves because the fire brigade would have been too late. Another man in that awful flood winter even built earth ramparts by himself around his home to keep it dry, and it worked. But it shows that we often have to be a lot more self-reliant than people elsewhere in the country where help is more readily available. Our countryside is absolutely beautiful though. Because we've got such a low population density, a lot of ancient sites have survived. Iron Age hill forts like Maiden Castle and Cadbury Castle, which are surprisingly good for kicking a football about on. Stone circles and ancient burial mounds. Dorset alone has, I am told, about 50% of England's remaining burial mounds, which is only a fraction of what they used to be. Farmers often just plough around them, leaving them undisturbed. There's been a local legend in decades gone by that dragons slept under those mounds, lying on treasure. And it turned out there was truth to it. Many did have treasures buried with the dead beneath them. And now that treasure's sometimes on display in local museums. One particularly atmospheric site is the Hellstone Dolmen here, overlooking Lyme Bay. It used to be a burial mound with an internal chamber, but over time the earth blew away, leaving just the stones holding up the empty space. When the light shines through it from inside, it's wonderfully eerie. And I love it. So let's go back to where it all began, back in the deep, deep past. The ice sheet that covered much of northern Europe never quite reached the southwest peninsula, although temperatures were too cold here for permanent settlement at that time. Sea levels were also lower then, and there might even have been no sea in between us and Wales. As the ice retreated, life became possible again in the southwest and in wider England. One of the people who lived here long ago is Cheddar Man, the skeleton you see in the picture to your left. He was uncovered at Cheddar Gorge in Somerset and had his DNA tested. And his DNA showed similarities with many local people still living in the area today when he was discovered. It's amazing to think there's still a genetic link between people who lived here in the dim and distant past and those living in the southwest still today. When the ice first retreated, people had no stone homes and didn't farm. They roamed the land, collecting nuts and berries and hunting for meat. They moved with the seasons. Sometimes they made stone tools, but mostly they left very little archaeological evidence. One thing we do know about them, though, is that they seem to have left offerings at springs. Evidence of religious activity appears near springs, with acorns deposited at ancient sites. Fascinatingly, this tradition goes all the way back to Bath, where there's still Roman baths today. Many of the earliest archaeological sites in England are in the southwest, particularly places like Aveline's Hole in Somerset. Bodies were interred there over a period of around 5,000 years. These include people from Mesolithic times, the earliest inhabitants, as well as later Neolithic hunter-gatherers who crossed the Channel from France and Spain. These settlers brought farming to the land. They set themselves up in long barrow tombs, chambers for burying their dead, with entrances for visits. Later, these people shifted to using round barrows without entrances. You can still see these today. On the right is a picture of the Binkham Bumps overlooking Weymouth, a scenic, incredible sight still visible. They also began settling the marshes of Somerset, places like the Sweet Track, a reconstruction of which you can see in the lower right, were ancient causeways laid across islands and salt marshes. These allowed people to cross the mud without getting stuck. The tracks were used for religious purposes too. Broken objects were thrown into the marsh as offerings to the gods. However, these people eventually faced threats from newcomers arriving from the continent. Around this time, many of the stone henges and monuments visible in the landscape began to be built. One of the most dramatic examples is Avebury in Wiltshire, shown in the centre of the picture. A village exists inside a stone circle there, and this place isn't far from Stonehenge, so here's a tip for tourists. If you want to see a stone circle in Britain, don't go to Stonehenge, go to Avebury instead. You can get right up to the stones for free and enjoy a drink in the pub afterwards. No hefty entrance fees like at Stonehenge. The people who came after the Neolithic farmers are known as the Celts. They established kingdoms in the West Country. The Dumnoni, who gave their name to Devon, the Dobuni, who were centred around Gloucestershire and Somerset, and the Durotriges, whose name means farmers of the hard soil, who farmed the chalky lands of Dorset. They were very advanced. They issued their own coinage and made incredible bronze and iron weapons and tools. Sometimes they deliberately broke iron weapons to render them unusable, throwing them into bogs, wells and other places as offerings to their gods. The Celts lived on great Iron Age hill forts, building defensive earthen ramparts around flat areas where they had their homes. These hill forts are scattered all over the West Country and are fantastic places to walk, especially when you think about how old they are. Eventually, the Celts were challenged by the Romans, who crossed the sea and landed near Weymouth, if I'm correct. You can see reenactors in the top left corner depicting a battle between the Romans and Celts. Maiden Castle was one of the most vivid battle sites. Excavations uncovered warriors who died fighting the Romans, including one with a ballista bolt lodged in his spine. You can see these remains at the Dorset County Museum today. Alongside ballista bolts, hundreds of pebbles from Chesil Beach were found, flung by locals to try to keep the Romans at bay from their fort. However, the Celts lost. The Romans were not kept at bay. They came in, built a temple on top of Maiden Castle, the remnants of which you can still see today, and they forced the Durotriges tribe to move from their castle into the town of Dorchester, where you can still see parts of Roman walls, as in the bottom left picture. The street patterns there still reflect the ancient Roman town layout. There's even an amphitheatre made of earth, and many roads around here, including the one between Dorchester and Weymouth, that follow the routes of ancient Roman roads. These were probably built upon older tribal footpaths. A map of Roman settlements in the southwest, on the bottom right, shows that settlements became denser closer to the main part of England and Wales, and sparser as you move further down the peninsula. By the time you reach the tip of Cornwall, the Cornish likely were having very little day-to-day contact with the Romans. The Cornish still claim they were never colonised by Rome. Another remarkable contribution from the Romans is the beautiful bathhouses like the one in Bath, Aquae Sulis. The baths were dedicated to the local god Sulis, whom the Romans identified with Minerva, Athena in Greek mythology. So while the Romans maintained the religious shrine, they added the entertainment complex of the baths, which remain to this day. And yet, the Romans left the southwest worse than they found it. Although they left a rich cultural legacy, the flags of Somerset and Wessex were developed from Roman cavalry standards. The Romano-British they left behind had lost the ability to mint their own coins, and their skill at tool-making and weaponsmithy had degraded substantially. On the withdrawal of the Romans, several Celtic kingdoms re-emerged in our area. Caerbaden around Bath, Glasdenning near Glastonbury, and Cornubia in modern-day Cornwall. The most powerful of these was Dumnonia. But even all these kingdoms together, even with help from the legendary King Arthur, could only hold off the advancing Anglo-Saxons for about 100 years. The Celts left many place names in the landscape, such as those with Coombe in them, related to the Welsh Cwm meaning valley. They also left many legends, including the legend of King Arthur. According to legend, King Arthur was based at Cadbury Castle in Somerset and was born at Tintagel in Cornwall, a dramatic headland whose castle required only 3 archers to defend it against a whole army. If you visit the site today, you'll understand why. The Arthurian legend of the Lady of the Lake also contains strong echoes of the Celtic worship of goddesses in the waters of our region, especially the parts where Arthur receives his magical sword Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake from beneath the waters. Before long, however, the Celts were gradually pushed back by the Kingdom of Wessex, which eventually united the whole southwest peninsula under King Egbert, who ended Cornish independence. The picture for the remaining Celts was not completely hopeless though. Unlike much of the rest of the country, there is evidence from genetics and law codes that no genocide occurred here against the Celtic peoples. Whereas places like Kent, Sussex and Essex expelled or even killed off the Romano-British after the Anglo-Saxons took over, Wessex allowed them to remain, as long as they accepted subservience to the incoming Anglo-Saxon nobility. The Kingdom of Wessex is, in my view, an underrated kingdom in world history. In the Dark Ages, kings like Ine promoted international trade by founding Southampton and establishing law codes. And the Shire Reeve system of governance, combined with an official Witan or parliament, served as a positive template for balanced and developed government. This allowed Wessex to gain control of the peninsula and promote stability, peace, and even a measure of prosperity for its subjects. Sadly, the peace King Egbert established by uniting the southwest did not last. Viking raiders appeared, one of the earliest incidents being at the island of Portland, where Vikings killed the local reeve who went out to meet them upon landing. The Viking threat grew in severity, eventually defeating all the other English kingdoms, pushing even Wessex and King Alfred back to a few areas of the Somerset levels. The map below left shows what the county looked like then. The blue area marks the seas and salt marshes which were Wessex's last holdout. It was a difficult terrain to traverse and became the last refuge where Alfred waged guerrilla warfare against the Vikings before returning with as many county militiamen as he could muster to fight the Great Battle of Edington, pushing the Vikings out of the southwest and successfully defending his kingdom. The only English kingdom to maintain its independence from the Vikings. Somerset's motto, Somersetum Ale, meaning all the men of Somerset, comes from this time, when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that all the men of Somerset rallied to King Alfred. Dorset's motto, Who's afeard, also originates from this period, referring to those willing or afraid to join the county militia. The Dorset flag also comes from this time, often thought modern, but it actually is very old. Dorset's modern flag is the cross of Saint White, a Christian nun who was captured by the Vikings and refused to renounce her faith despite threats. She was killed for her steadfastness and became the patron saint of Dorset, which the flag commemorates. Around this time, King Alfred also established the first permanent navy of Wessex to defend the coast from Viking raids, aiming to intercept them before they reached shore. This marked a significant moment in West Country history and its long-standing relationship with the sea. Over the next 100 years, Wessex was to expand, eventually pushing the Vikings out of all England and uniting the English people under its rule. For this reason, our region has a strong claim to being the heartland of England, the place that not only saved the rest of the nation, but also unified it. Sadly, however, this was not the last turbulent period England would know. In 1066, William the Conqueror, known by many at the time as William the Bastard, crossed the English Channel with a fleet of Normans, Frisians and Bretons, and any others he was able to convince into following him. Him and his orcas, an Anglo-Saxon word meaning murderers, landed at Hastings and used many underhand tactics such as false retreats, massed archer fire and the pillaging of civilians against the heroic Anglo-Saxon armies led by Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, which took place on Senlac Hill. Sadly, after enduring many hours of relentless assaults by Norman cavalry, bowmen and armoured knights, the militiamen of Wessex were unable to hold their own against the continental forces any longer and were defeated and killed. The Normans took control of the whole of England after that and ruled with extreme cruelty, oppressing the peasantry ruthlessly. One striking indicator of this oppression is the scarcity of surviving Anglo-Saxon stone buildings. Although Anglo-Saxons did build in stone churches, cathedrals and other structures, the Normans tore most down, intent on eradicating the memory of the independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Indeed, within a few years of 1066, only 2% of English land remained with the original pre-conquest owners, and large areas of England's north had been pillaged into desolation. For the West Country, this was a particularly big loss. We went from being an area which was the core of England, which we had been crucial in unifying, to a peripheral location within the Norman realm. From this point forward, the rulers would no longer have spoke with our accent, and local thanes responsible for and to their local villages were replaced by remote Norman barons living far away who often did not even speak English. A fairly low feudal system with local accountability and even quasi-democratic institutions like the Witan, Wessex's Parliament, was replaced with a high feudal system where regular villagers or villeins legally held very little sway with their liege lords. Legally had to lay before them for a substantial portion of the year and could not even move to a neighbouring settlement without permission. Unfortunately, this was one of those times when the bad guys won, at least temporarily. Some of the last resistance to Norman rule occurred in the southwest, Exeter was famous for mooning King William's armies during their siege, and the last significant resistance I know of happened around the town of Montacute, pictured here. The Normans had built a Motte and Bailey castle atop a hill and taken all the village's holy relics into it. The local people revolted at this and besieged the castle, seeking their return. However, sadly, the Normans quickly received reinforcements and crushed this resistance. Aside from the political estrangement, life in the southwest continued its rhythm over the next few centuries. Crops were brought in, harvested and sown. Fish were caught in the sea and brought to harbour, and the seasons still turned. However, an event was on the horizon that would cast an apocalyptic shadow over the rest of the region's history. A shadow still visible today. I remember growing up, cycling past a site that had once been a village before the arrival of this devastation. Now, only fields remain, but you can still see the outlines of the houses in the grass. The event I am referring to is the Black Death. As this map shows, prior to the Black Death or bubonic plague, the population density in the southwest was similar to much of the rest of the country, certainly to the southeast and the Midlands, yet this disease changed everything. It first landed at Weymouth. You can see the harbour in the background of this slide. From there it spread inland, affecting regions and cities throughout England, but arrived first and had its most dramatic effect here. It's thought around a third of England's population was killed by the bubonic plague, but in many parts of the southwest that figure has been estimated at closer to 50%. That picture with the walls in the fields shows another deserted village in Cornwall. So many people died during the Black Death that they believed the apocalypse had actually come. Monks wrote of living in the end of days, of the world being judged for its wickedness, and of wondering whether it was even worth their time to write, seeing as they didn't think anyone would come after them to read. With so few survivors, there weren't enough people to work the fields, build the walls or carry on trades. No cobblers for shoes, coopers for barrels, or fletchers for arrows. This meant demand for workers was sky high, and the number of labourers low, which meant for the first time since the Norman invasion, the peasantry began to have more of a say in their own destiny. When the government tried to impose a poll tax to fund wars with France, people rose up, and the southwest was at the forefront of that revolt, particularly in Somerset. In Bridgewater, townsfolk revolted, took over the town and stopped the court from sitting. At Ilchester, rebels ransacked the local jail and freed prisoners. That spirit was still alive many centuries later, when the government again tried to introduce a poll tax in the early 1990s, and Bridgewater people again stood against it, as in this picture here. Just as in the Middle Ages, more modern common people also successfully resisted too. In those times though, the peasants used the scarcity of labour to force the government to listen, and they had their grievances addressed. The Black Death had depopulated our region more severely than elsewhere, but its aftermath brought some positive changes. Peasants gained more rights. They could now move towns without their lord's permission, pay their rent in money instead of free labour, and negotiate for better working conditions. However, the depopulation of the southwest remained, and never again would our region rival other parts of England for density of population. We had become a wilder, less tame place, and that character would endure for centuries to come, even till today. One way that untamed character manifests itself is through the enduring of many old customs which have died out or are a lot less common elsewhere in England. This was not for lack of trying on the part of the authorities though. Records from Glastonbury and Exeter shows abbots and bishops repeatedly trying to rein in peasant practices, passing edicts banning offerings at springs, a custom going back to Mesolithic times. Their failure to stop this practice, though, is shown by the fact that the edicts had to be reissued time and time again. In fact, the tradition survives into modern times. When I was young, my mum would tell me to throw a coin in a well and make a wish. Springs still tend to be respected across the southwest, the occurrence of a natural spring often meriting a garden. There even still exist shrines around some springs, such as the Red Spring at Chalice Well in Glastonbury, and next door the White Spring, which is pictured here. Despite passing laws, the church made little effort to evangelise the peasants once the nobility had been converted. In fact, so few priests were available to the peasantry here for weddings and baptisms, a custom developed. Couples would marry by jumping over a broomstick together, formalising it later if a priest arrived. This practice spread to the south of the USA, especially among enslaved people there who did not have access to formal wedding ceremonies. The southwest also preserved other unusual traditions. In some towns, hobby horse processions still parade through the streets, likely pre-Christian fertility celebrations. Wassailing and other ancient customs survive too. Folk practices such as dowsing also remain fairly common. I've done this myself. Holding rods, I found that they would cross over a cup of water I'd placed in the room, as well as the underfloor water pipe. My brother was sceptical, but when he tried it, sure enough, the rods crossed over the water, and I remember the look on his face. I don't know why it works, there must be a scientific explanation, but such traditions have lasted here longer and more widely than elsewhere. Medieval times also saw the birth of piracy in the southwest. During the 100 Years' War, French raiders attacked our shores and fishing boats. In response, coastal towns armed merchant vessels or raised small navies of their own. Rogues from England, France, Holland and Spain crisscrossed the channel. The Fowey gallants of Cornwall pictured here were particularly notorious. This equilibrium changed upon the Moors' expulsion from Spain. After this, Moorish raiders began attacking our coast in swift, shallow-draft ships. They captured fishing boats and occasionally even took people from ashore and sold them into slavery in Africa. Despite pleas for assistance, help from the government, which was caught up in the final spasms of the Wars of the Roses, did not appear, and so the southwest defended itself as best it could, with privateers like the Fowey gallants leading the fight, profitably for themselves wherever possible. Specialised cannons called murderers, lighter than standard ones and mounted on swivel posts, were developed, allowing crews to kill or wound without sinking ships, preserving the vessel and cargo for capture and later resale. Despite the lack of help for our region from the government, new taxes were imposed in 1497 to fund wars against France and Scotland. This injustice prompted the massive Cornish Rebellion of 1497, a conflict which one historian has compared in size to World War II in terms of the percentage of the population who were involved. At first, the rebels were very successful. As they marched towards London, they gained massive support and recruits from Devon and Somerset. They avoided major damage to towns, but outside of the southwest they found little sympathy. They almost reached London itself and were camped next to Deptford Bridge when the King's army caught up with and sadly defeated them. So many Cornishmen died in that conflict that the Cornish language went into steep decline. By the 1500s, books stopped being printed in Cornish and it ceased to be a literary language, a crucial and sad stage on that language's march towards extinction. The event is still remembered today. In 1997, marchers in this picture on the right retraced the rebellion's route and walked all the way from Cornwall to Deptford Bridge. Another major medieval development was enclosure. Fields had existed in the West Country for untold millennia. Celtic field patterns were small and square and farmed communally. Saxon fields were long and thin, each house owning a strip with communal grazing and fishing rights. But in medieval times, pressure grew to enclose land for profit, cash crops or sheep grazing. This happened nationwide, but in the southwest it threatened many who relied on common land, so resistance was strong, and communal farming and access to land lasted much longer here. One major protest was the Western Rising of 1549, partly over the prayer book but also against the growth of enclosures. Wealthy landowners were fencing off grazing and fishing spots. The rich grew richer, the poor hungrier. Unlike elsewhere, enclosure in the southwest was never fully completed, with acts continuing right into Victorian times. Even today, disputes around enclosure persist. On Dartmoor, landowners have tried to end wild camping rights. Protesters, invoking Old Crochan, the Dartmoor spirit said to dislike mean landlords, warned them, "Be careful, or Old Crochan will come and get you." You can see them here in this picture on the left, doing a protest concert with a figure of Old Crochan. A big reason why many opposed the enclosures was because people didn't want to lose use of the land. On Dartmoor, for example, those protesters in the picture are fighting to be able to camp on the wild land of their choosing. The people who officially own the land say they don't want others camping on land which they own. It was the same with enclosures. We went from a system where people could simply graze their cattle, fish the rivers and use the land as they wished, to a system where all the land was owned by certain individuals and you had to get their permission. Even if you could find them, they weren't necessarily likely to give it. What tended to happen was that people who owned and enclosed the land were able to make money from it and grew richer, while those who lost access to land and fishing rights grew poorer. Without these resources, they gradually became more and more hungry and desperate. One way people were able to alleviate their hunger and desperation was by going to sea. Fishing had been a way of life for untold generations, and each share of the profits from a fishing trip would be divided amongst the boat's owners and crew by prior agreement. It did not take much to transfer this arrangement to privateering vessels. As I mentioned before, privateer raids had occurred across the Channel for centuries and were part of the pattern of life. The French and others would raid our fishing and merchants, and we'd sometimes raid theirs in turn. The wheel turned. Privateering was therefore long established in West Country communities as a source of income and was looked upon by local communities with a spirit of acceptance, if not always pride. The practice was not entirely condemned by the government either, and even if it had been, their ability to stamp out piracy in these parts was lacking. However, when the Spanish colonised the New World, everything changed. Suddenly, there were massive treasure fleets carrying gold across the Atlantic, wealth being used by the Spanish courts to impose Catholicism in Central Europe. Thus, a number of motivations came together. A pre-existing tradition of privateering, the lure of enormous treasure shipments, and a Puritan desire to help fellow Protestants in continental Europe. For these reasons, many West Country gentlemen and common folk, especially those forced out by enclosures or as younger sons unable to inherit property, found piracy an appealing and potentially profitable prospect. Attacks on Spanish shipping were accepted and even encouraged by the government, and the private navies that had once deterred piracy were now increasingly engaged in raiding Spanish treasure fleets. Some even ventured into the Caribbean to attack Spanish settlements directly, seizing whatever plunder they could. Crews went to sea under contract, each surviving crewman taking an agreed share of any profits made. The Spanish eventually lost patience and sent the Armada up the English Channel to subdue these English pirates and bring our island under their control. Of course, we weren't having that. The West Country coast was on the front line, and our privateers played a massive part in stopping the Spanish Armada. The Spanish did not have a good time of it. Their cumbersome ships, more fitted out for carrying cargo or soldiers than ship-to-ship combat, were outranged and outmanoeuvred by our vessels, armed with long-range cannons. Though the Spanish had more ships, they were steadily picked off in home waters, and by the time they reached Calais, the Armada was highly demoralised. During the battle up the Channel, one of the most powerful of the Spanish ships, San Salvador, was captured and towed back to Weymouth harbour. Taking the ship would have been both militarily significant in removing a key Spanish asset from play, and also would have netted the privateer crews a fortune in reselling the vessel and prize money. This also makes sense of something which had puzzled me for some time. A 1597 ship register shows a Francis of Weymouth registered to Weymouth harbour, a ship possessing some 57 cannons. How a small town like Weymouth possessed such a powerful vessel puzzled me, until I discovered this story. It is possible the San Salvador was renamed Francis of Weymouth and entered into the registry, a massive win for the town. Another tale from the Armada I know of tells of a Portlander serving as a first officer. During the battle, he lured 2 Spanish galleons onto the rocks near Pulpit Rock by pretending his own vessel was about to founder. At the last moment, he used his knowledge of a local current called the Race to escape, leaving the Spaniards to destruction. Local seamanship and knowledge of the waters like this played a massive role in defeating the Armada, and the West Country sailors very much held the day. Even today, memory of piracy lingers in West Country culture, to the extent that everyone knows that your stereotypical pirate speaks with a West Country accent. Weymouth hosts an annual pirate festival celebrating this history with reenactments and drumming and all sorts, like in this picture. Plymouth, Poole, Bristol, and even smaller towns like Swanage and Bridport also had privateering industries back in the day. However, privateering did not always protect us. In the early 17th century, Moorish pirates from Africa, in fast, shallow-drafted xebecs, their type of boat, launched particularly heavy raids on southwest England, capturing people to sell as slaves in North Africa, as shown in the picture on the left. This gave towns strong incentive to maintain privateer vessels, both as an offensive and defensive measure. With the privateers out of their depth, however, the West Country appealed to the Crown for help. Charles I responded by attempting to levy the unpopular ship tax to fund defences, but most of the country refused to pay this tax, leaving the southwest to its own devices. Privateering thus remained both a means of defence and a lucrative, if questionable, source of income. Charles I's unpopular taxes, along with other decisions, helped plunge England into civil war. The war pitted the extremely Protestant and literate Puritans against Catholics and the religiously indifferent, many of whom tended to be more rural. In the southwest, where literacy was lower and towns fewer, urban centres tended to side with Parliament, while the much bigger rural hinterlands supported the king. Thus, although the county towns declared for Parliament at the war's outset, royalist support quickly overwhelmed them, giving the king strong control of the region. Over time, however, the West Country's lack of industry and manpower, compared to the parliamentary-held south and east, proved fatal. Cromwell's better resourced parliamentary army eventually crushed royalist resistance. The last royalist infantry were defeated at the Battle of Langport. During the social disruption of the Civil War, witchcraft persecution was at its highest. It was the time of Matthew Hopkins, the infamous witchfinder general, fevered accusations and inquisition against the backdrop of a society fraying at the seams. However, witch persecution was far less intense in the southwest than elsewhere, particularly compared to Puritan East Anglia. Prosecutions here were about a tenth the rate of elsewhere, and were largely confined to towns with Puritan influence. By comparison with the rest of the country, the southwest was a relatively tolerant place in a time of religious strife. After parliamentary victory in the Civil War, the monarchy was briefly abolished. However, Puritan rule proved even more unpopular. Oliver Cromwell even tried to ban Christmas and introduced all kinds of arbitrary restrictions on people. When he died, a relieved population swiftly restored Charles I's son, Charles II, to the throne. This set the stage for the last battle fought on English soil, the Monmouth Rebellion. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, illegitimate son of Charles II, landed at Lyme Regis from Holland and raised an army from disaffected West Country folk. Many opposed enclosures, centralisation, or still resented the outcome of the Civil War. Monmouth's support in Devon, Dorset and Somerset was strong among the common people, but he failed to attract professional soldiers or gentry. His army was poorly equipped, with farmhands wielding scythes instead of pikes, as in the picture on the left, and farm horses having to stand in for cavalry. Despite rallying the west behind him, Monmouth failed to advance beyond Bath and Bristol, and with the King's army in turn advancing to meet him, he retreated to Bridgewater. Monmouth then decided to launch a desperate night attack under cover of mist, but mistakenly advanced on the wrong side of a drainage ditch. Though his army had approached quietly, they were discovered, and the King's army quickly rallied. The rebels' makeshift cavalry charged, willing to risk their lives to buy time for the infantry to form up. However, the untrained farm horses fled at the noise of battle when charged by the King's own cavalry, leaving the infantry exposed. For hours, The rebel farmers stood bravely under fire from across the ditch, desperately trying to form and reform a firing line as their colleagues fell all around them. But when dawn burned away the mist and the sun rose, their helpless situation was revealed. The king's forces charged and scattered them. Many were captured and taken to Bristol to be taken on into slavery. They had given their all and held their line in the most horrendous of circumstances until that daybreak. It is thought that over 4,000 rebels were killed, wounded or captured in total after that engagement. One of my own relatives fought there, and my Uncle John has told me that stories of that fateful night and terrible dawn were passed down in our family even into his own childhood. For the southwest, Western Zoyland is our Alamo. A monument stands there today, a testament to all who fought, who were doing right as they gave it. The Duke of Monmouth was immensely popular in the southwest even after the battle. But finding out about him, I cannot get over the fact that he himself fled as soon as the army's cover was blown. An aristocrat from elsewhere running away and leaving his men to die in their hundreds to cover his escape. He was captured and executed in London. What came afterwards, however, was to leave a mark just as great as the battle, perhaps in some ways even greater. The bloody assizes. After the Battle of Western Zoyland, the king sent to the West Country one Judge Jeffreys, a brutal man with instructions to punish any surviving rebels. Jeffreys conducted cruel show trials across our region. Those accused rebels who came before him had no chance of acquittal, only punishment or death. One infamous tale from Dorchester tells of a woman who begged Jeffreys to spare her brother. He demanded her company for the night, and in the morning asked her to open the curtains outside of their room. As she opened the curtains, she saw her brother hanging outside, and when she turned, saw Jeffreys laughing at her. His cruelty earned him hatred for generations, and it was said that locals would spit on the ground at the mention of his name for decades after the assizes themselves. All in all these events over the centuries had given the Southwest a reputation for being somewhat rebellious, not very rule-abiding, self-reliant and hard to govern. Forced to defend ourselves when wider England would not help us, our region had grown to lean on privateering and our own traditions. But after the Monmouth Rebellion, the government had had enough. Authority was imposed with increasing success, bringing our region more firmly under government control. One way this increasing centralised authority was felt was in the decline of the smuggling industry across the southwest. Long ago, there were no government controls on trade with other countries. People came and went across the channel freely, with no one to enforce restrictions. We would trade cloth and wool with the French, and they would trade wine, spices and other goods with us. This worked very well until the 17th century, when the idea arose that trade should be restricted to encourage domestic industry. Tariffs were introduced, taxes charged at ports, and naturally, we didn't want to pay them. In many communities, this made smuggling become a way of life. In Dorset, for example, there are tunnels linking local churches to the beach, as in Moonfleet. Customs agents wouldn't want to look in a church crypt. On Chesil Beach, it was said a smuggler could gauge his location at night by picking up a pebble and judging its size. In places like the Jamaica Inn in Cornwall, they became famous or infamous for smuggling. Rumours even suggested that smuggling sometimes extended to the deliberate wrecking of ships. Historically, people have always had the right to salvage items washed up between the tide lines. Once property was in their hands, it became legally theirs, a practice called right of salvage that still continues today. In the past, this was crucial for survival. Driftwood and other materials were used for building. A woman near Beminster, I know for instance, has a house roof made from the remains of an old boat. Useful materials from the sea were repurposed in various ways, which were particularly important in a region lacking raw materials and easy access to supplies. Some stories, however, claim ships were deliberately lured onto rocks so their goods could be salvaged using lanterns hung from donkeys to mimic masts swaying at sea. When ships approached, they would crash, often with deadly consequences. Local remembrance of this dark past does exist, and I believe was nodded to by the name of North Devon's local radio station Lantern FM. However, there is little historical evidence of any deliberate intent, as was hinted at by the Jamaica Inn story. The truth, though, is that most southwest communities worked hard to rescue sailors in distress. Volunteer lifeboat crews trained rigorously, often racing each other, a tradition that influenced modern rowing teams, particularly in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, where annual rowing festivals are still held. Over time, smuggling declined as enforcement from London gradually increased. Enforcers, old-time custom officials, sometimes faced ostracism or even outright violence from communities that resented their interference. But there was little sympathy from local communities for the enforcers' plight. Ghost stories from this period almost invariably depict smugglers as sympathetic, with government agents cast as the villains. The West Country's secluded bays, like Walborough Bay seen here, facilitated smuggling practices such as exchanging goods via buoys in the Channel, a system reminiscent of geocaching today. The decline of smuggling also raised questions about industrialisation. I have often said that the West Country is what England would look like if it hadn't industrialised. But why did that not happen here? Well, why build factories when goods could be smuggled in cheaply? Perhaps in some ways we were our own worst enemy. Although, I, for one, am glad that we have kept our unspoilt natural environment much better than many other parts of the country. An exception to the industrialisation, however, was Cornwall. Early industrial efforts there, such as tin mining and innovations by pioneers like Richard Trevithick in steam locomotives, were crucial to the Industrial Revolution. Trevithick designed steam pumps which were able to pump water out of mines, allowing deeper mining in more difficult terrain. He also experimented with steam-powered carriages to transport goods by road and rail, developing the first steam engine even before Robert Stephenson. It was called the Penny Darren locomotive. However, the Industrial Revolution in Cornwall ultimately collapsed. The tin ran out, and when it did, there were no other industries to fall back on. Unlike the Pennine area, which developed mills and factories, Cornwall was at the very tip of the West Country peninsula. Far from its markets, it lacked the road or port network needed to move goods quickly. Unlike the Pennines and Midlands, which had strong canal and road connections and were in the heart of the country, close to big population centres for markets, even at the earliest stages of the industrial period. The West Country, without this infrastructure, was at a big disadvantage. But as time progressed, we worked with that which we did have and began to integrate more with the rest of the country. Tourism began to emerge, as seen with the Osmington White Horse. Weymouth became one of England's earliest tourist towns, attracting visitors like King George III, which it commemorated with a chalk statue of him sitting proudly atop his horse overlooking the bay. Weymouth loved King George III, and there is a highly regarded statue of him in the town centre on the seafront to this day. However, sadly, local legend suggests the king misinterpreted the White Horse's orientation as a sign he was unwelcome. You see, rather than riding towards the town, the White Horse shows the king riding away from the town. King George III interpreted this to mean the townsfolk wanted him to leave, and so he did, and never returned. The designer of the White Horse tragically is even said to have taken his own life as a result of this costly misunderstanding. Despite these setbacks, however, the economy of the West Country was changing. While the agricultural bedrock remained, gradually becoming more enclosed and efficient over time, there was a gradual shift away from piracy and smuggling towards tourism and industry. Religion also played a role in societal change. Methodism, popularised by John Wesley, emphasised personal understanding of Christian teachings, encouraging reading and education, not just attending sacraments and getting your children baptised or being married in a church. Further to this, Methodists also established schools, often teaching the poor to read and write for the first time. On Portland, for example, Methodism spread modern English, replacing the older dialect and creating a transformative societal shift across all the southwest communities where they operated. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the southwest was well moving away from its smuggling and privateering heritage, integrating with the rest of the country, innovating technologically and relying more on national rather than local defence. During the American Revolution, for example, the French Navy briefly terrorised local fishermen at Toole Bay. With no privateer vessels existing anymore, the towns did not look to themselves but appealed to London and the Royal Navy for protection instead. Whether we liked it or not, we were no longer in a position to look to our own defences, but increasingly relying on central government for our protection. Victorian times continued these changes. Although the rest of the country experienced rapid industrialisation, which was lacking here, the southwest also saw its share of dramatic transformations. While celebrated in much of the rest of the country for providing cheaper food to the populace, the repeal of the Corn Laws in Victorian times were devastating for the West Country. The repeal of this act ended tariffs and subsidies for farmers, meaning that they were undercut by foreign competition and could not afford to pay their workers enough for them to even survive on, leaving field labourers and their families underpaid and starving. Many left for urban centres, while others tried to improve conditions by forming agricultural workers' unions, which were illegal at the time. One group who tried to do this were the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who ended up being transported to Australia for their union activity. Public outcry eventually led to their return, and the village of Tolpuddle now commemorates them with an annual festival. However, most transported prisoners were not so lucky to be allowed to return, and thousands ended up being forcibly transported to Australia, sometimes for something as trifling as stealing food to feed their own families. Tourism and infrastructure growth helped to offset these hardships though. Railways were built from London, Bristol, Plymouth and Portsmouth and created a fast network, bringing visitors from wealthy and industrialised cities who were able to spend that wealth locally here in the southwest. Piers and amusements were created for these visitors, such as the famous Minehead Pier seen here. As time progressed, we were able to use new technologies to increase our agriculture's competitiveness once again. A key piece of machinery used to do this was the steam-powered traction engine. The first traction engine was built at Wellington in Somerset. An early steam-powered proto-tractor, the traction engine increased productivity and competitiveness, allowing our farms to once again return to profitability and go back to being the bedrock of our region's prosperity. Today, this time is remembered at steam rallies, still very popular around the West Country today. And no steam rally is complete without its tractor engine parade. These machines were ingenious, real Swiss Army knives of vehicles. And if you visit a steam rally, you will see how these machines can power saws, operate machinery, and so much more. Thus, during the Victorian era, the southwest increasingly harnessed its land for agriculture, tourism, and technological innovation, integrating with the wider country or leaving behind its old smuggling and privateering traditions. At the same time, more and more decisions were being made in London, with the West Country deciding less and less of our own laws, and suffering the consequences, such as the Cornwall repeal, which presented significant challenges for us. The 20th century was a good time for the West Country, for the most part at least. As we moved into the century, the challenges of the Corn Law repeal were behind us, and tourism was on the rise, giving us a new engine for prosperity and growth. In the early part of the century, along with the rest of the country, we faced 2 world wars. World War II in particular was a trying time, as we suddenly found ourselves on the front line of the conflict. But then, we had been here before, with both the Armada and the Vikings. Our sunny tourist beaches became entangled with barbed wire and tank traps instead of windbreaks and holiday makers. My granddad told me about growing up playing in bomb craters. We were inundated with evacuees from London, Birmingham and other big cities fleeing the bombing. Yet we suffered our own blitz, just as the rest of the country did. For many families, though, hosting those evacuee children was actually a real bonding experience. My great-grandmother had her evacuees coming to visit her for decades and decades after the war. Taking on the townsfolk became an opportunity to build friendships and links to last a lifetime for many people. Every town in the West played its part in the war effort, taking on evacuees, producing munitions and equipment for the soldiers, even growing enough food to feed our civilian population and our armies. Just as on other occasions where we have faced conflict. Before long, the war finished. We had all done our part, and peace returned. It's good to see those beaches once again filled with holidaymakers, happy and peaceful, full of life and fun as they should be. The contrast, though, is striking, which is why I've selected those 2 old photographs, almost identical shots of the same beach, one scarred by war, the other full of life and enjoyment. Tourism has returned, and in recent years has been buoyed by Brexit and COVID making domestic holidays more attractive in the UK. You might find it interesting that in the West Country you have two local words for tourist, grockle and emmet. Grockle is a word more common to Dorset and Devon. If you hear it, it isn't derogatory, so don't worry, and there are a number of theories about where the word came from. Emmet is Cornish. It's from the Cornish language, and it is their word for ant. The tourists, like ants, swarm over everything in their enjoyment of the area, which is always nice to see, especially when they bring money with them. As well as the tourist industry returning after World War II, the World Wars also brought connections to the defence industry, connections which still persist today. In Dorset, tanks are still maintained for the army. The old Sopwith Camel and Spitfire factory in Yeovil now produces helicopters for the Army, Navy and Air Force, as well as for many nations abroad. Plymouth continues to be home to naval industries, as does Dartmouth and other parts of the region. This tradition of industrial excellence is something we've capitalised on. It may seem surprising that a deeply agricultural region produces such advanced technology, but perhaps it shouldn't be. We once built privateer vessels that crossed oceans and were better than any vessel that had been built before. Today, we have used that same skill set to build the world's fastest helicopter, the Lynx made in Yeovil, and the world's fastest civilian airliner, Concorde, built at Filton near Bristol. Even the Aerial Atom showcases this ability, producing a vehicle with insane acceleration and go-kart handling, the world's best lightweight performance road legal car. Barely road legal anyway. So the 20th and early 21st centuries have proved that the Southwest is fully capable of success. Despite the stereotype of us being backward or slow, we've shown that we can achieve just as much as any other region or any other people in the world. To conclude this presentation, I remember once seeing a new slogan in Yeovil: the heart of the country, the mind of a city. And I thought, I understand the heart of the country part, but the mind of a city? Really, Yeovil? But do we truly want the mind of a city? Yes, it's good to have the money and the innovation, but we've been doing that ourselves for hundreds of years. When we set our minds to it, we can do fantastic things, sometimes without even really trying, and we can do it without sacrificing our pristine environment or our vast heritage. Take the Bridgewater Carnival. So many brightly lit floats illuminate the procession that it can be seen from space. People travel from hundreds of miles around to see the spectacularly choreographed routines and the beautiful floats. It's absolutely fantastic. Despite our famously relaxed attitude, we also have a tradition of excellence. We are not just the home of farmers and fishermen. We are the home of Olympic medal winners, ace designers, athletes and innovators. Yet at the same time, we still take our children to wishing wells and encourage them to throw in a penny and make a wish. I've certainly done it with my son. And that's probably not too different from our Mesolithic ancestors, like Cheddarman, who made offerings of acorns by the springs at Bath many thousands of years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. It has been a real labour of love to make this presentation, and I am so pleased to have told just a small part of our region's story. A story too rarely told. but one I hope I have shared adequately here. If you disagree or think you could do better, then please do, because the more people who tell our story, the better known it will become, as it deserves to be. I'll sign off with this last slide, showing some of our biggest media organisations and the logos of major Southwest companies past and present. They're all proof that when we put our minds and efforts into something, we can achieve great things just like anywhere else. And if you stay for the closing photographs, you'll see some of the stunning scenery that makes our region so special. If you're not from the Southwest, please do consider paying us a visit. We'd love to welcome you, and there is so much here for you to enjoy. Thank you, and goodbye.